Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about a major new development involving Russia, one of the world's largest paint manufacturers, and three businesses that have effectively been taken away from their overseas owners. Because Vladimir Putin has recently signed a decree placing Russian subsidiaries of Dutch multinational AkzoNobel under what Russia calls temporary external administration. Now that phrase sounds fairly bureaucratic. It sounds as though an accountant has been brought in to tidy up the books, restructure the business and keep everything running. But that's not really what's happening here. AkzoNobel says it has lost control of its Russian subsidiaries. The shares and ownership interests have been transferred into the hands of a Russian company appointed by the Kremlin. So although Russia is using the word temporary, the practical reality is that the overseas owner can no longer control its own businesses, appoint its own management, or decide what happens to the assets. In plain English, Russia has taken control. And this is not an isolated incident. It's the latest chapter in a much bigger transfer of factories, energy companies, food producers, breweries, farms and industrial businesses from foreign shareholders into Russian hands. Now before we get into the details on all of this, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? It's completely free, it's not really a subscription, it just shows that you're interested in my videos, but it does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. And if you can see that hype symbol alongside where you can give me a thumbs up, please hit it because it helps to promote this video and make sure that it reaches as many people as possible. So thank you if you've hit the hype. Now AkzoNobel is a major Dutch multinational and the company is behind paint and coatings brands including Dulux, Sikkens, International and Interpon. Globally, it generates revenue of around $10 billion per year and employs around 30,000 people. Now Russia was never the biggest part of the group, but it was a meaningful operation. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia represented around 2% of AkzoNobel's global revenue and the company employed around 640 people in Russia. 2% of 10 billion would suggest the business generating somewhere in the region of $200 million per year. And the more recent Russian accounts appear to support that broad scale. Reports based on local company filings suggest AkzoNobel's three main Russian entities generated combined revenue of around 17 billion rubles in 2025, which is equivalent to around $200 million, although that was down from around 21 billion rubles the previous year. The largest of the three subsidiaries of AkzoNobel, Decor, was reportedly generating around 8 billion rubles of turnover on its own. The presidential decree applies to the shares in AkzoNobel Decor and ownership interests in AkzoNobel Coatings and AkzoNobel Lacquerkrosserka. Apologies for my pronunciation there, but my Dutch isn't very good, neither's my Russian. These were not empty holding companies containing nothing but paperwork. They represented a functioning Russian manufacturing and distribution business supplying decorative paint and other coatings to the domestic market. AkzoNobel had also invested directly in Russian production capacity. One of its early projects was a powder coatings plant near Moscow, which involved an investment of around $13 billion. So there are physical factories, equipment distribution arrangements, employees, customer relationships and established brands involved here. And this is what makes the story significant. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, AkzoNobel stopped a large proportion of its Russian activities. It suspended its marine, protective and yacht coatings businesses. It stopped vehicle refinishing, automotive and aerospace coatings. It also discontinued parts of its industrial, packaging, wood finishing and powder coatings operations. However, it did not completely leave Russia. AkzoNobel continued operating its decorative paints business, arguing that the remaining activities had been localized and ring-fenced. The company said the Russian operations were being run independently with no financial support from AkzoNobel's Dutch parent company. That distinction was important. AkzoNobel was effectively saying that it stopped supplying many of the more industrial or strategically sensitive parts of its portfolio, but it would continue producing ordinary decorative paint for Russian consumers. Nevertheless, campaign groups criticised the company for staying in Russia. One investigation estimated that AkzoNobel's Russian subsidiaries generated approximately $177 million of revenue in 2022, only slightly below their pre-invasion level, and paid around 8 million in Russian taxes. So for more than 4 years, AkzoNobel appears to have tried to walk a very difficult line. It reduced its exposure, it stopped large sections of the business from operating and localised what remained, and prevented the Dutch parent from providing additional financial support, but it continued operating and continued employing hundreds of people. And now, after all of that, Russia has decided to take control anyway. The businesses have been handed to a Russian company called Razvitsky Stolensky Aktivov, which roughly translates to Development of Construction Assets. And this name's important because it's the very same company that was appointed to manage the Russian factories of a Danish insulation manufacturer Rockwool in January 2026. Rockwool had 4 factories in Russia. When President Putin placed those factories under external administration, Rockwool said that it had lost control of the assets and would remove them from its accounts. In other words, the factories had not been technically described as permanently nationalised, but from the perspective of Rockwool's shareholders, control had disappeared and the value effectively was written off. Now, the same administrator has now been given control of AkzoNobel's Russian operations. That suggests this may not be a temporary caretaker arrangement. Russia appears to be assembling a domestically controlled construction materials group using foreign-owned factories. Rockwool produces insulation, AkzoNobel produces paints and coatings. Both businesses supply products used extensively in construction, renovation, infrastructure and industry. Putting them under the same administrator may allow Russia to preserve the factories, brands, customer networks and technical capabilities while removing the foreign shareholders. Russia will argue that this is temporary management rather than confiscation. The legal mechanism comes from a presidential decree originally introduced in April 2023. That decree allows the Russian government to place assets owned by individuals or businesses from so-called unfriendly countries under temporary management. Officially, Russia says the measure can be used in response to Western governments freezing or taking control of Russian assets overseas. But the decree gives President Putin enormous discretion. The foreign shareholder may technically remain the legal owner, but the Russian administrator receives the power to manage the business. The administrator can control operations, exercise shareholder rights, appoint management and decide how the assets are used. And there is generally no clear deadline explaining when or whether the original owner will regain control. So the word temporary could mean 6 months, could mean 6 years, it could mean that control is never returned at all. So we've already seen this with some of the largest Western investments in Russia. In April 2023, Russia placed the Russian energy assets of Finland's Fortum and Germany's Uniper under state control. Uniper owned more than 83% of the Russian electricity producer Uniper, which employed over 4,000 people. Fortum said Russia had removed the chief executive of its subsidiary and deprived Fortum of its shareholder rights. A few months later, Russia took control of Danone's Russian food businesses and Carlsberg's Bolkita brewing operation. Carlsberg had already negotiated a deal to sell Bolkita and leave Russia, but before that transaction could be completed, the Kremlin stepped in and seized control for nothing. Carlsberg described the move as a theft of its business. Management of the brewery was handed to a Russian executive with close historic links to the company and also to President Putin. Danone's operation was initially placed under the control of Yakub Zakhariev, a Chechen official and close ally of Ramzan Kadyrov. Danone was eventually permitted to sell its business, but only after losing control and accepting a heavily discounted transaction. Carlsberg also eventually regained the ability to complete a sale, but the company took a substantial financial hit and exited under conditions dictated by Moscow. It was reported that they received €1. Russia also targeted businesses outside food and energy. In 2024, the Russian subsidiaries of Italian heating company Ariston and German appliance manufacturer BHS, part of the Bosch group, were placed under management of a Gazprom-owned company. Ariston said it had received no advance warning. At the time, the business employed around 200 people and generated revenue of around $100 million per year. Russia also took control of Agroterra, one of the country's largest agricultural landholders. Agroterra cultivated approximately 265,000 hectares of farmland and had ownership links to Dutch and American investment groups. There have also been seizures and court orders affecting the assets of UniCredit, Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank following disputes linked to sanctions energy products. So there are now several ways which foreign investors can lose control of Russian assets. President Putin can sign a decree placing them under temporary administration. A Russian court can freeze bank accounts, property or shares, or a company attempting to leave can be forced to sell at a dramatic discount and pay a huge contribution to the Russian government. Under Russia's tightened exit rules, businesses from unfriendly countries can be required to sell their assets at a discount of at least 60% to their assessed market value. On top of that, an exit contribution equivalent to as much as 35% of the assessed value can be payable to the Russian budget. That does not necessarily mean the seller receives only 5% in every transaction, but the rules and calculations are much more complicated than just straightforward percentages. And it demonstrates the scale of value that can be extracted. The foreign owner builds the factory, trains the workforce, develops the supply chain, and establishes the brands. Then, when it wants to leave, the Russian state controls the valuation, approves the buyer, dictates the discount, and collects an exit payment. And if the Kremlin does not approve of the proposed deal, it can simply place the business under external management. Research by the Kyiv School of Economics estimates that foreign companies have suffered more than $170 billion worth of direct losses in Russia at the start of 2025. So that doesn't include the latest deal that we're talking about for AkzoNobel. That includes asset write-offs, businesses sold at enormous discounts, court seizures, exit taxes, and outright loss of control. And the AkzoNobel case adds another significant business to that total. In the short term, Russia benefits. Factories continue operating, Russian workers remain employed, locally connected buyers receive valuable businesses at enormous discounts, the government collects exit payments and tax revenue, and Russia retains manufacturing capabilities that might otherwise have disappeared. But the long-term implications are extremely damaging. Foreign direct investment depends on confidence. A company will only invest hundreds of millions or billions of dollars building factories, power stations, and distribution networks if it believes its ownership rights will be protected. Once a government demonstrates those assets can be taken away by presidential decree, every future investment requires a much higher potential return to justify the risk. Why would a Western manufacturer build a new Russian factory when an existing factory can be transferred to a Kremlin-appointed administrator overnight? Why would a pension fund finance Russian infrastructure when its ownership rights could be suspended indefinitely? Why would a technology business transfer advanced processes, patents, or technical knowledge into a country where it might lose control of the operation? Russia may retain some foreign businesses from China, India, Turkey, and the Middle East, but those investors will also be watching what's happening with interest. The nationality of the victim may change, but the legal precedent remains. If political relations deteriorate, assets can be reclassified as strategically important, hostile, or subject to temporary management. That uncertainty raises the cost of capital across the entire Russian economy. It encourages companies to avoid fixed investments. It discourages long-term projects. It makes investors favour short-term trading relationships rather than building factories. And it increases Russia's dependence on state-controlled companies and a relatively small circle of politically connected domestic owners. There is another important problem as well. Taking control of a factory does not automatically preserve everything that made that factory successful. Russia may gain the buildings and machinery, but it can lose access to global research and development, specialist chemicals, software, replacement equipment, international quality control systems, and new product development. Paint and coatings can be highly technical products. Industrial coatings protect ships, pipelines, buildings, machinery, and vehicles from corrosion, heat, chemicals, and weather. The value does not lie only in the tin of paint. It lies in the formula, certification, testing, technical support, and continuous development behind it. AkzoNobel has already stopped supplying several advanced coating businesses in Russia. Now that the remaining subsidiaries have been removed from its control, the connection with the parent company is likely to become even weaker. Russia may therefore preserve the production volume while gradually losing quality, innovation, and access to newer technology. And this is the broader story of the Russian economy. Assets are not disappearing overnight. Factories are still standing. People are still turning up to work. Products are still coming off the production lines. but the ownership structure, the investment pipeline, and the access to international expertise are being steadily hollowed out. Russia is exchanging long-term investment credibility for short-term control. The Kremlin can take over one factory and keep it running. It can take over 10 factories. It may even be able to take over 100 factories, but it can't force the next generation of global companies to invest billions of dollars building new ones. And that's why the AkzoNobel story is much bigger than paint. It sends a clear message to every multinational that stayed in Russia, every company still trying to negotiate an exit, and every investor considering returning in the future. You may own the shares, you may have paid for the factory, you may have complied with all of the Russian laws, you may have localized the business and continued employing Russian workers, but ultimately, the business is only yours for as long as the Kremlin allows it to be. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hit that hype button if you can see it down by the thumbs up, and give me a thumbs up as well if you can. I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supported me. If you've bought me a coffee, or sent me YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you for that support. It really, really does help to keep me making these videos, so really appreciate it. Also like to say that my new channel, Build and Design, is now live. I've set this up with a friend of mine who's a master builder. We're currently documenting the build of 4 big houses, but we're going to be doing a whole lot of other stuff. They've already teased a few other things. There's more exciting stuff coming. If you could help us out, we're really early stages. We don't have 1,000 subscribers. We don't have any watch time yet. If you could watch some of the videos and subscribe, that would be brilliant. Really appreciate it.